Let's just get started. Let me welcome you all to the Columbia India Summit of 2025. I just want to start by saying a few words here for a couple of minutes before we get started. I want to make three small points, let's say. As you all know, first is India's growth matters, not just for India, but for the whole world. So 1 in 6 people in the world are Indians, and what happens in India is no longer just relevant for the subcontinent, but it's very much in the coming years and decades, India will be a key driving engine for the global economy. And if things work well, that's good for India and the world, but if things don't work well, that's a reason for us all to work on that story of India, to understand that story and potentially even hopefully contribute to make sure that it works well. So that's kind of the first point I wanted to say, and that's kind of the goal, one of the themes we always try to elucidate and work with at the conference. The second point I wanted to make is on themes. As a lot of you, I've talked to many of you here, and you've spent years working on issues related to India, the Indian economy, but much of the discussion of India, especially in the economics world, outside India is about development economics often. So it's how to reduce poverty. And those issues are, of course, very, very relevant, and there's a huge group of people working on those issues. But to our mind, there's not enough attention on many other aspects of the Indian economy. And the Indian economy is potentially one of the most complex economies that I've worked on. I've had a chance to work on several. And it's a universe within the labor markets, the financial markets, the trade. And so a lot of these themes don't get enough attention, but we need to understand those issues well to understand the story of India and India's growth. And you see that in the theme of the conference, what we've chosen for you. We're going to have 4 sessions, and they'll be focused on trade, on innovation, on macro and growth issues, and all on jobs and skills and talent. So we want to shed more light on those aspects which don't get enough attention, and that's one of the goals of our summit. And then the third is, as I've said before, we are unique in this, at the center in terms of bringing together, is the right center for Indian economic policy. So we bring India, economics, and policies. And I believe there's almost no one out there, outside of India especially, bringing all those 3 things together. And that is reflected also in the lineup we've chosen, the people we've chosen here to speak and share their ideas with and engage with you. I've personally learned a lot from many and most of them over the years in how they have worked at different parts of that intersection. Some have, for example, you'll see a computer scientist who's still doing policy work. So we have people working in the defense sector, but a lot in the policy. So we bring together people who are working at various aspects of that intersection. We believe it's it's a service we can provide to foster more dialogue in that space, because that's really relevant, I would say. So those are the 3 points I wanted to make at the beginning. And just, before, I thought I'll also just thank our donors and sponsors. So we have, of course, Mr. Deepak and Ms. Neera Raj as the one of the founding donors of the center, who will be here shortly if they're not here yet. And also, we also have the 4th session is going to be the Kotak Distinguished Lecture delivered by Prithviraj Chaudhary, whose book you've seen outside. And that's also something we're trying to revive and have come back every year. And we've had very distinguished speakers, including Prithviraj this year. So, and that we want to thank for that Ms. Uday, Mr. Uday and Ms. Pallavi Kotak for their generous support for that. So let me, with that, just stop here and get on with the first session, which is going to be Trade in Turmoil. And we will have Mr. Adnan Mazarei. We will have Professor Pravin Krishna, and we will have Professor Devashish Mitra. So let's get them on here. and welcome them with a warm round of applause. But I should also say we would love you to engage and ask questions, and so please don't feel shy and bring that Indian spirit of discussion with you. Yeah.
Thankful to Ruchir and the Reich Center for allowing me to be with you. Starting a few years ago, concerns about over-reliance on China, be it for critical minerals all the way to final product, goods and services, induced people in the US and Europe to start thinking more and more about shifting away from China. Automatically, almost, placing India as a potential beneficiary, giving it a new impetus for growth and development. But then, in April, a few other things happened. The United States imposed tariffs of 26% on India. 26. And the concern is now whether India will be hurt by these, or given that other countries, especially China, will have higher tariffs or other restrictions, and depending on how India deals with the issue, it will benefit. Much will, of course, depend on the ability of Indian policymakers and institutions to adapt. There is a concern that with the increased protectionism in the past few years, this path may be difficult. To help us understand these issues, we have two very qualified speakers. Professor Pravin Krishna, a distinguished professor at the International Economics and Business at Johns Hopkins. Professor Krishna's fields of research interest are international economics, political economy, economic development, and the Indian economy. We will also have Professor Devashish Mitra, professor and chair of economics in the Syracuse University. Professor Mitra teaches economics and is a Gerald B. and Daphna Kramer Professor of Global Economics Affairs at the Maxwell School in Syracuse. May I please ask them to join us? Each will have 15 to 20 minutes to make their presentation. I will probably cough or something when there's 2 minutes left, and there hopefully will not be need for more drastic measures. And then we will have a question and answer session. I will start it, but then you guys are the real show, and you will lead it. Thank you.
Well, let me just start by thanking Ruchir and everybody else that's worked so hard to put this conference together. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for inviting my participation. We had a pre-conference dinner yesterday, and we had such a great time that I more or less forgot everything that I wanted to say this morning. So I'm actually glad there's a 1-minute interruption here. I can quickly go through my slides and see, okay, there we are, to see what I wanted to say. Okay, so the topic for the panel for the session is trade in turmoil, and you've all heard a number of things in the news and the headlines in the last few weeks, I'm sure, about tariffs and reciprocity and what's fair and what's reciprocal and trade balances and so on and so forth. And so what I thought I would do to sort of set the stage here for our discussion a bit was to begin by putting some of this in context. So I'm gonna proceed in 3 steps here in my presentation. First, I'd like to talk about what is it that's exactly gone on with respect to trade policy and trade policy changes that have been announced by the Trump administration, and discuss a bit the extent to which these sort of violate very dramatically the entire post-World War II order of international trade that sort of has been overseen trade relations between nations since the late 1940s. Right? So I want to talk a bit about what the mechanisms were that were in place governing international trade and the extent to which the administration's sort of policy changes violate that. In particular, I'll be talking about how non-discrimination in trade relations was a very important principle of international trade set in 1947, when the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, was first put in place, World War II, following World War II, and how that's completely being violated today. Okay? I'll talk a bit about how what was allowed in the GATT as a national security exemption, which is to say that the normal rules of trade could be briefly suspended in case two countries were at war with each other, for example, how there's been a wholesale abuse of this national security exemption in the current regime coming out of Trump administration to essentially use national security as a reason to justify virtually any trade policy choices that they'd like to make. I'll talk a bit as well about the collapse of the dispute settlement mechanism. So one of the very important pieces of the World Trade System was the dispute settlement mechanism that allowed countries, rich or poor, member countries of the World Trade Organization, to petition and sort of argue against unfair measures by other countries. And partially because of the actions of the Trump administration, what you have right now is a non-functioning dispute settlement mechanisms. There aren't any judges that could bench cases, essentially. And so you have a completely dysfunctional WTO at this point that cannot restrain in any particular way the actions that we're seeing coming out of the White House. So that's one. The second, I wanted to talk a bit about the policy drivers. What is it that is driving this policy, at least what are the stated goals of this policy? Right? We all understand a bit, I think, the background, partially because of these have been important issues in the election campaigns that preceded all this. There's a concern in the U.S., maybe a legitimate concern about the deindustrialization of the U.S., the fact that manufacturing employment in this country has sort of gone down very dramatically since the 1940s to maybe about 7-8%, depending on how one counts. It could even be as low as 3 or 4% of the overall labor force. So that's potentially a concern. There are worries that after China entered the WTO, which was in the year 2001, that this process has somehow accelerated, and the deindustrialization process of the U.S. has essentially been accelerated by Chinese entry, and that there's sort of some unfair trading practices being practiced by China that are the driver of this. That's on the one hand, so you've got deindustrialization, the China shock. There also seems to be a very heavy emphasis, and this is slightly unusual and slightly new, the level of this emphasis, this kind of mercantilist view of trade balances, which is where you say countries believe that exports are good, and that imports are bad. The more you export is better, the more you import it makes it worse. But this ignores a very, very basic idea in international economics, and students of economics here will recognize very, very quickly that U.S. net exports, in fact, any country's net exports, have to equal the gap between U.S. savings and U.S. investment. So a country's net exports are equal to the gap between savings and investment. And so in the end, what your trade balances are to a much smaller extent determined by somebody else's trade barriers and so on, and to a much greater extent determined by your own savings investment gap. And the reality is that U.S. savings have been below U.S. investment for well over 2 decades now. And the main driver of the gap, essentially the trade deficit, is that trade balance. And so to sort of look at that and say somebody else is cheating us or someone else is exploiting us is kind of a misplaced focus. If that is bad, then this focus on bilateral trade balances is even worse, which is what the Trump administration has followed in setting its trade policy, as announced on Liberation Day very recently, which Adnan referred to as well. And so I'll talk a bit about that too. And finally, I want to come to India and talk a bit about what this actually means, all of these policy changes mean for India given its own development challenges and development needs. So number one is that there's a very urgent need for structural transformation of the Indian economy. So you have about 50% of the Indian workforce in agriculture, a little bit less, producing just about 15% of the output. So it's a very low productivity activity, and for decades now it's been recognized that one of the important urgent needs is to move workers out of low productivity agriculture into manufacturing services. That's not happening quickly enough. India's trade footprint is very modest. Its global value chain footprint is very modest. The China plus one strategy, which was referred to earlier, which people started thinking about following the first, the actions during the first Trump administration. How do you get some of those businesses that China might be exiting or that China might be pushed out of? We have actually had very limited success. India's had very limited success with occupying those spaces, right? For a number of good reasons, mostly having to do with domestic policy, to some extent trade policy as well. But low Indian productivity is the primary contributor of the fact, primary driver of this fact that we haven't done as well picking up those businesses. So all of these low Indian productivity, our own trade policies, our sort of demographic challenges, our need to transition, all of this has been complicated considerably further by what's happening today. So the recent developments complicate this environment very considerably, the policy choices. As such, from a trade policy standpoint, you can have unilateral choices that you could be making, in which India, if anything, in the last couple of years has gone backwards. Rather than liberalizing trade and figuring out ways in which they could integrate more effectively into global value chains and so on, the unilateral tariffs of India have gone up by a few percent, which was unfortunate. India's engaged in a number of different trade agreements over the last decade or two, over a dozen trade agreements. But while these are good and attractive, make for attractive headlines, the reality of Indian trade agreements is that they're really quite shallow, right? So most of the relevant goods are exempted from the liberalization under the trade agreements. And the nature of these agreements has been such, for a variety of reasons that we can discuss, that there's hardly been a dent in terms of the amount of trade that takes place under these agreements is very, very small compared to what it could be. And that's primarily because of the way in which India's intentionally designed shallow agreements rather than more competitive, deeper ones. That still leaves us with the question now of what can one do with respect to future trade policy. Are there potential agreements that one can get into? There's some discussion now about an India-US trade agreement. There's some possibilities of India joining what was a Trans-Pacific Partnership abandoned by the US, what's rebranded now as a CPTPP with Pacific Rim countries. Some possibilities there for India, but whether we seize this moment and sort of figure out ways in which to manage the domestic political economy in India to integrate with the rest of the world through these agreements, better integrate with the rest of the world through these agreements is yet to be seen. So that was about the broad outline in a sense of my talk, and I'm just going to quickly go through various things that I want to say. So just to say that the interwar years were very important years from the standpoint of the design of the international trade system. The Great Depression, which you're all aware of, was prolonged. There was a deepening of the Great Depression because of the various trade and exchange rate policies undertaken by countries in that time. And the U.S. emerged as the strong nation after World War II, wanting to turn its back on the arbitrariness of that period, and decided to led the movement to put in place sort of a non-discriminatory trade architecture in which you could not have tariffs being set on a one-on-one basis, which is to say you could not say that I'm going to have a tariff on cars on Japan that's going to be a certain rate and a tariff on some other country that's going to be a different rate. It had to be all on a non-discriminatory basis. This was the most favored nation principle, Article 1 of the GATT, the non-discriminatory architecture of the GATT, which has sort of been in place since then. There were some exemptions allowed, notably to create free trade agreements, customs unions, and also as I mentioned earlier, a national security clause which said if you are in exceptional circumstances where your national security is threatened, then you could deviate from this principle of non-discrimination, but not otherwise. So in the last 75 years or so, it's very rarely been the case that the national security clause has been invoked, except most recently by the Trump administration. Okay, so this was the non-discriminatory architecture of the GATT worked very successfully. There were huge increases in volumes of trade, trade in the year 2000 was 25 times its 1950 levels, a very substantial liberalization. Average tariffs dropped from 35% to 5%. So all in all, a very successful sort of run for the international trade system. All of that started to change a bit. There's some background there as well, but without getting into that, when you start to look at the Trump presidency 1.0, so 2016 to 2020, you started to hear very sort of new sorts of arguments in Washington, D.C., about the need for sort of bilateral reciprocity. So essentially saying, we don't really care about this non-discrimination clause. We're going to treat you the way that you treat us. If you have a tariff of a certain amount, we're going to put the same tariff on you. which would be a violation of this kind of non-discriminatory principle and so on. And also this idea that U.S. national security is being threatened in multiple different ways, right? So the National Security Clause was used in the first Trump administration to justify the very selective steel and aluminum tariffs that they imposed on the Canadians, the Mexicans, Indians, the Europeans, and various allies, and so on and so forth, which was a bit puzzling. And it was disturbing to see the U.S., which had been sort of this, the leading nation in sort of developing the rules of the GATT and ensuring that they were more or less complied with, so quickly deviate from the rules and the norms by invoking the National Security Clause and so forth. These were substantial deviations. The other big thing, which I've already mentioned, is this kind of the collapse of the dispute settlement mechanism. So the U.S. has had some disappointments with the way that dispute settlement works at the WTO. It started under the Obama administration, with the Obama administration saying, unless these issues are properly resolved, we're not going to reappoint judges, right? So judges are appointed for a limited amount of time at the WTO, and by the time that sort of, people retire from these positions, they're not reappointed because of U.S. opposition, and by the time you got to, I think, 2018, 2019, there's no judges left at the WTO, right? So you can have whatever violations you want, you can sort of grossly deviate from WTO principles. If anybody complains, there's nobody to complain to, in effect, okay? The important thing to understand from the standpoint of U.S. policy here is that there's an understanding out there, narrative even, not totally unreasonable, that these violations were sort of essentially committed by the Trump administration, right? But what's important to understand is that none of that was rolled back under the Biden administration. So there was a great expectation come 2020 that the Biden administration would reverse the trade war that had been initiated against the Chinese. That did not happen. There was a great expectation that the dispute settlement mechanism would be restored and the judges would be reappointed and so on and so forth. That did not happen either, right? Which is to say that this sort of attitude about international trade, the sense that somehow the U.S. has been exploited, that there's deindustrialization that we need to worry about, is not simply an obsession of the Trump White House or President Trump himself. There's a broader support for these sorts of ideas, I would say, including in the Biden administration. They've obviously dealt with issues differently, but this basic sense that something is off with the international trade system and that needs to be corrected there's more of a bipartisan sort of support for that sort of ideas than is commonly appreciated. Okay? And it's worth keeping in mind. So of course, when Trump came to office, a variety of campaign promises, a very aggressive trade policy, and one of the reasons it's been a little hard to understand what exactly the Trump administration or President Trump is interested in is because there have been multiple motivations that have been offered by various people involved with the campaign and currently in the White House. One of these is that we would like to raise revenue very dramatically, right? So we actually want to replace internal taxes, income taxes and so on with external taxes. The other is that we want to reindustrialize the U.S. and bring back manufacturing to the U.S. Another is that trade deficits are a measure of the exploitation of us by partner countries, and so we're going to remedy that using reciprocal tariffs that, again, violate non-discrimination and so forth. And so which of these is dominant, which of these is relevant? Is there some fourth reason that we don't even fully understand? It's not entirely clear. What is to be understood is that the authorities for these policy changes rest with the president, right? So normally if you had a trade agreement, let's say NAFTA, something else, has to be approved by Congress. But if you go through particular sort of windows here, which is national security motivations, or if you're accusing a country of unfair trading practices, then the authority to implement those trade policy changes rests with the president. And this is the reason that the Trump administration has been able to implement things in the way that it has without having to worry about congressional support, without having to go to anybody else to seek that support. So in any event, you've all seen these charts, I'm sure, about what policies were actually announced on April 2nd, very substantial tariffs, including those on India, 26%. There's been lots of changes, even relative to this original graph in the weeks that have followed. A very dramatic increase of tariffs on China, some pauses with respect to other countries and so forth. But this gives you a sense about at least one level of focus that they have on the bilateral trade deficit, which was the basis for this particular formula. Okay? Let me just take these points one at a time. Is it really feasible that you can replace income taxes in the U.S. by trade taxes? And it should be seen that it's almost impossible to do that, right? So tariff revenues are about 1% of government revenues, and to now say we're going to take a base which gives us 1% revenues, and then you get 50% of government revenues out of that, which is what income taxes are, more than 50%. That's basically an impossibility. Even if you went to the highest kind of revenue maximizing level of tariffs, which would be very distortionary and costly. Bringing back manufacturing, right? And to what extent is China responsible? To what extent is NAFTA responsible for the deindustrialization of the US? This is a graph of manufacturing employment as a share of total employment. And you see this is a kind of a secular decline over time. This is the red line over there. This is a long process that's been ongoing for many, many decades now. And it would be sort of a bit of a mistake to place the blame of all of this on international trade. It would be maybe foolhardy to try to imagine that the types of tariffs that have been put in place are going to reverse this and bring back manufacturing to the glory days of the 1940s and 50s, where you had 30, 35% of the employment share. Okay? There is a concern often expressed here about the Chinese trade surpluses, which are seen here, reached $1 trillion in sort of trade surplus last year, 2024. But the important thing, which is what I was mentioning earlier, is that the flip side of this, the Chinese trade surplus, is that the US trade deficit, as an accounting matter, this is not economic theory, this is accounting, meaning it has to statistically match up, is equal to US savings minus US investment. And in a certain sense, what this means, and this is sometimes counterintuitive for people listening to this, is that the excess of US investments over US savings has been financed by the rest of the world. So if you want to have investments that are greater than your savings, the only way that that's going to happen is if you run a trade deficit. So in a certain sense, having that trade deficit is a boon for you. You're able to invest more than you saved. That's a reframing of the same exact statistical identity, but often in the context of political debates, it's thought about in exactly the opposite way, as though someone has exploited us, rather than by looking at it as someone helping us. Regardless, to address this issue, it's well known that it's obvious that you either have to increase your savings or decrease investment. Private savings and private investment are very challenging to kind of alter quickly. The one way that you can do it systematically, and the one driver of trade deficit, is really the government deficit, which tracks the US trade deficit very, very closely. So in fact, if you look at the year 2020 until now, year 2000 until now, the last 25 years, the correlation between the US trade deficit and the US federal deficit is something like 0.95, right? So which is to say the number one reason that you're seeing these trade deficits being run are because of the fiscal deficits of the US. This focus on bilateral trade deficits is also highly misleading for a number of reasons, having to do with the fact that the goods that are coming out of China, even to the US or to any other country, there's sometimes very limited value added being added on in China to these goods. And so whether it's a Japanese factory that's located in China, where there's some small amount of value added taking place in China before the good is finally shipped, all of that is going to look as if it's a Chinese export to the final destination, whereas in fact a large part of that value add could be Japanese. So at some basic level, trade statistics are extremely misleading right now because of this production fragmentation and the fact that international FDI is spread all over the place in a way that it's very, very difficult for people that pursue this for a living even to tell us with any accuracy who is exporting what to which country, right? So to imagine all of these expanding trade deficits with China as being Chinese alone is also not entirely fair to the situation. All right, very quickly, I'll take 2 or 3 minutes here to talk about India. We already talked about the need to transition from agriculture to industry and services and expand the export footprint and so on. There's been a number of challenges, background challenges for India, right? One of these is the stagnation of the WTO. Very little progress has taken place at the WTO for the last 25 years or so. The last round of trade negotiations, the Doha round, started, I think, in 1999, 2000, still not concluded, so you can see what's going on over there. There's globally policy goals of deglobalization, policy goals of kind of economic nationalization and so on, nationalism and so on. Here, as evidenced by Brexit, these have created their own challenges for India wanting to export more. You've got geopolitical uncertainties. You've got the super dominance of Chinese manufacturing, that regardless of what's gone on with respect to US trade policies and so forth, China continues to export more, which is a challenge for India as well. And of course, Trump 2.0. So let me skip over these shares quickly to say here that relative to China, India has done rather poorly with respect to global exports. We've gone up from maybe 0.5% in 1995 or so to a little less than 2%. And you can see the comparison with China over here. Our footprint in global value chains is also very limited, much less than our Asian neighbors. The one point I would make, and then I'll stop in a minute, is in general, when you look at Indian sort of policy history, it's had a very asynchronous relationship with what's going on in the rest of the world, right? So while there was all this trade liberalization going on between 1947 and say the year 1990, 2000, and so on, until 1990, the rest of the world was liberalizing. India was a very closed economy. Right? When India started liberalizing and said we'll have our big reforms starting in the 1990s, the rest of the world started looking away from multilateralism towards bilateral trade agreements. So this NAFTA, the EU, various other things were going on. By the time we started thinking about international trade agreements, the rest of the world wants to deglobalize, right? When we want to start talking about tariffs, everybody else is talking about intellectual property protection and so on. So there's been these challenges, right? I already talked about the fact that what little we have done with respect to bilateral agreements has had very modest effects, primarily because of our lack of ambition in the design of these agreements. Going forward, when we're talking about agreements with the United States and so on, I hope we're more ambitious in the way that we do this. With respect to unilateral policy as well, we've had kind of increases in tariffs rather than reductions in tariffs. Policy changes that are coming out of New Delhi that do not reflect what everybody else in the region is thinking, right? Most of the ASEAN countries, countries in Asia are sort of using trade policy, trying to figure out ways in which they could integrate better with the global value chains, global production networks, and so on. And that generally requires a reduction in tariffs. And we've seemed to have gone in the opposite direction, which is somewhat disappointing. And this is really my last slide. I'll leave some details for maybe the Q&A. The bilateral pressure from the U.S. at one level, it seems to me, and we have people here just come from New Delhi as well. They could probably inform us. Has caused a re-examination, I think, at some level of what unilateral policy choices we could make. Right? I hope that serves as a stimulus for thinking about ways in which we could somehow integrate this kind of MAGA, make America great again agenda of the Trump White House with the Make in India aspirations of the Modi administration, right? So what particular goods could the U.S. be exporting more to India that serve Indian purposes in terms of revitalizing its own manufacturing and so on? What are those input-output linkages, if any, and could we be selectively liberalizing those goods in ways that make the U.S. happy and that in fact stimulate Indian productivity? That's the first question. There's possibilities now that are being discussed about a bilateral trade agreement with the U.S. Maybe this is something that takes place in that context, right? There's some talk about the China plus one option again, given the magnitude of the tariffs on China that the U.S. has put. Does this open up some opportunities for India, right? The one thing I'll say here is that for most part, the lack of Indian export performance is the last point really that I want to make. Lack of Indian export performance, for most part, has not come out of what's going on with respect to global trade policies, right? The international trade system was very open to India since 1990 until now, in fact, from 1947 until now, right? China had the same access to the US and the rest of the world that India did, right? And Indian performance has fallen far short of what the Chinese have done, despite the fact that they've had exactly the same WTO platforms to work with. The reasons for those are all domestic. They have to do with lack of productivity, lack of scale, infrastructural challenges, business climate issues, and so on and so forth. India has done very, very well in the last 5, 10, 15 years to improve on each of these dimensions. And the real question, nonetheless, is have we done enough relative to what everybody else is doing? Is our productivity improving enough relative to how the Chinese have done with respect to their own productivity increases, their own technological improvements, and so on? Or do we still have a very substantial distance to go? Right? Our productivity improvements are not going to be enough to justify us an improved room in this space. And while the China plus one option is a theoretical possibility, in order to properly exploit that, it's going to take a good bit more from India, not necessarily just on the trade policy side alone, but with everything else that determines domestic productivity. So with that, let me stop. I didn't hear a cough from Adnan, so I'm not sure I went over
You
my...
were just, look, it would have been too embarrassing if they would have kicked me out if I had come. You were wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
All right. Many thanks to Richard for organizing this and inviting me, and to Mona for all the excellent arrangements. There is going to be a lot of overlap with what Pravin said, but there'll be things that are somewhat different. And so when I see an overlap, I might rush through those points. I want to start with a very basic issue of what a tariff is, because often there is this misconception that our tariffs on China will be paid by China, and consumers here will not bear any of the costs, which means that the domestic price here will remain the same, yet we will get manufacturing from abroad. That's a total impossibility, right? So it is a tax. An import tariff is a tax on imports, usually expressed as percent of price at the border. The price at the border is the price paid before the product crosses domestic boundaries. So an American wine importer buys wine in France at 18 euros a bottle, roughly $20 per bottle. At the port of entry, this importer, say, has to pay a 20% tariff, and then that means $4 as tariff. So the total cost to the importer then, abstracting from transport costs, is $24. That's going to be passed on to domestic consumers, because this importer is not doing charity, right? So, or the French producers also will be reluctant to actually take a hit on their price and profits. So contrary to President Trump's claim, the cost of a tariff, at least most of it, is borne by the domestic consumer, or an import using domestic producer, right? So if a domestic producer is using those imports of that product as an input, that is going to be borne by that domestic producer, who might pass on some of it to the consumers as well. So China doesn't pay for all of the tariffs on U.S. imports from China. So that's, if you were thinking that China pays for all of the tariffs on U.S. imports from China, that's not correct. And that's also been shown empirically, that tariff passes into domestic, the pass-through to domestic prices is close to 100%. So Pravin talked about the motivation for tariffs for President Trump. So these are the three motives. It's a negotiating tool, it's a generator of revenues, and then it's an instrument to balance trade. So it cannot be all three at the same time. If it's a negotiating tool, that means you basically have like reciprocal tariff liberalization, right? So both countries, your trading partner reduces tariffs to zero, you reduce tariffs to zero. Where is the revenue then coming from, right? An instrument that helps balance trade, Pravin already talked about the macroeconomic aspects of the trade balance. I'll also talk some in a bit, but tariffs cannot fix the trade balance. Last time I was here, it was in October, and the elections the conference was held a couple of weeks before the presidential elections here. And so the predictions based on campaign promises and based on what analysts were writing was that there would be across-the-board tariffs, up to 60% on China, up to 20% on others, and that U.S. allies will also face extreme uncertainty. At that talk, I mentioned these points. I also mentioned this quote from Opsfeld and Clausing, which is that, the Trump's new tariffs will apply to more than 8 times more imports than his last round. And Martin Wolf around that time wrote that his first-term trade policy would look like relatively modest starter protectionism. So now, the other thing that I said was that cooperation with allies on supply chains would be unlikely. Those slapped with high tariffs are unlikely to cooperate. The smaller countries might cooperate, but the larger countries, we're seeing, China is showing a lot of resistance, EU will also not easily cave. They will also be hard negotiators on this. So, and also visa restrictions, including on H-1B and other work visas, so that would limit service trade. We are seeing that right now, the visa doesn't even mean anything anymore, right? And the possibility, the other thing that I said was that there was the possibility of a bigger trade war with China because there would be bigger tariffs and that would get bigger responses. But so far, everything has turned out to be much worse than predicted, right? We thought that was bad, but this is much worse. So the most recent one is the reciprocal tariff fiasco, right? Pravin talked about this a bit. Reciprocal tariffs were announced on Liberation Day, April 2nd, 2025. And if you look at the reciprocal tariffs, 46% on Vietnam, 32% on Taiwan, 26% on India, and 25% on South Korea. So these tariffs that I'm showing are a bit different from what Pravin showed, because mine are import-weighted average tariffs. And so if you look at their tariffs, the overall tariffs, the average tariffs, it's Vietnam's is 9%, Taiwan 2%, India 12%, and South Korea 8%. So this is, if you remove agriculture, these averages are going to be much lower, actually. So clearly these are not reciprocal, right? So why are they not reciprocal? Because what the Trump administration has done, it has basically is looking for a reduction in imports, right? That will make, that will exactly equal their trade deficit with that country, right? So basically, the change in tariffs should be such that the reduction in imports should be exactly equal to their trade deficit. That basically they came up with a complicated formula for that, which also included things like the pass-through, the pass-through of tariffs into domestic prices and responsiveness of imports to domestic prices. Now, what they did was once they put in that, the formula with some actual numbers, these are not actual numbers, they assumed that they quoted studies and said the pass-through was 25%, when actually it is close to 100%. Even one of the co-authors came on one of the channels and said, we never said it was 25%, right? It was more like 95%. But the pass-through is actually close to 100%. They assumed it was 25% in combination with an import demand elasticity of 4. So once you put that 25% and 4, you come up with this formula where the tariff reduction is just the tariff increase on a country is just the ratio of the trade deficit to the imports. And then they say they give a 50% concession, so then you multiply by 0.5. But if you actually put the right pass-through, it would have been a fourth of that. So they are not actually giving a 50% concession, even by their faulty formula, they're actually doubling what it should be, right? Because they're not putting the right parameters. And there's also, no, add later. And there's also a slight math mistake in it, okay? So the trade deficit in goods was used, right? US has a trade surplus in services with the rest of the world. Using the same problematic formula, should the rest of the world tax US services at 37%, right? 10% baseline tariff makes no sense. US has a trade surplus with Brazil and Australia, right? So you cannot have balanced bilateral trade in goods with all trading partners. It's like you cannot have it unless you have a barter system, basically. You know, like I am teaching my students and their parents are paying the university, you know, are compensating for my services through their tuition fees to the university, right? So the university has a trade surplus with their parents, but their parents might be doctors, lawyers, so on. They have their clients and patients, and with them they have a trade surplus. And why are we not, you know, everyone's trade is not balanced individually? Because we have money there, we are doing away with the double coincidence of wants, right? Similarly, if you know, take goods, services, and assets, then, you know, trade will be balanced, right? So that's the capital inflow part that Pravin talked about. So if you know, instead of money, you know, we use assets to, you know, fill that deficit, right? So this is basically balanced trade country by country doesn't make sense in a modern system, right? We thought President Trump was going back 100 years, 200 years on certain things, but on this, he's going back thousands of years, right? When there was barter system. So USTR also assumes on their website that offsetting exchange rate and general equilibrium effects are small. So they are neglecting all those effects. That means no learner symmetry. That is, you know, the learner symmetry means that import barriers also act as export barriers, and input-output linkages are being ignored here, right? So that is a huge assumption, because you use tariffs to increase net exports, right? What's going to happen is that there's going to be some exchange rate reaction to it, which could totally offset it, right? So the role of comparative advantage is ignored here in the trade deficit, right? So their assumption is that if you have a trade surplus, it must be because you're treating us unfairly. But in a lot of goods, right, and given that you're ignoring services, those countries might have a comparative advantage, right? A colleague in political science was talking about how the US has always, when it's losing like this, has blamed the unfairness of the other country. It was in the 80s and early 90s, it was Japan. And, you know, people in the, you know, congressmen, senators were taking Japanese electronics products and hitting them, making a public show with baseball bats and crushing them, right? So they couldn't compete on automobiles, they couldn't compete on electronics, but then it was the unfairness of the trading partner. So this is not just the Trump era, it has been there for quite a few decades now. So then there's the role of attractiveness of US assets. Everyone wants to invest in US assets, and that basically means that capital will flow in, and that will create the trade deficit. So, and the role of macroeconomic policy and, you know, macroeconomic variables is totally ignored. You know, if you consume, you know, if there's high consumption, high government expenditure, that's going to create trade deficit as well. And Pravin showed that equation, S minus I is equal to net exports. So, you know, it comes from that. This comes from that. So So due to the impact on the stock and especially the bond markets, not stated explicitly by the Trump administration, there's a 90-day delay announced in the implementation of the tariffs. So until then, we have 10% tariffs on all countries, but 145% on imports from China, 25% on automobiles and auto parts, 25% tariff on aluminum and steel, and a 90-day pause on tariffs on smartphones, computers, and electronics. So that's the latest thing that happened, though President Trump says he's been talking to China. They've been having talks, but so far the reporting says there's no proof of that. So, so how should India respond? Pointless to retaliate. Let me make it very clear. It's pointless for India to retaliate, not much to gain, right? India will hurt itself more from it through retaliation. One possible approach is unilateral reduction in tariffs on imports from all countries. And because one of the things one must realize that a trade deal with the US no longer means anything. The US is a very unreliable trading partner, right? There's so much, we talk about the tariff, but there's a lot of tariff uncertainty. There's a lot of trade policy uncertainty, and that trade policy uncertainty could be as bad as high tariffs, right? Because, producers need to know what tariffs will be there in the next 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. We don't even know what tariff will be there in the next 2 hours, right? Your tariffs could change with, when we are having lunch, you might have different tariffs, right? So that creates a lot of uncertainty for producers. What are they going to base their, investment decisions on, right? I think, the best thing for India to do is unilateral liberalization. It was highly successful in increasing growth and reduction in poverty in the 90s and the first decade of the 2000s. And so it's an important, it's also an opportunity for India to show some leadership. Rather than being a follower, India could be a leader here and take the initiative and in moving the rest. This sounds very unrealistic, but this is what I would have liked to see. India showing some leadership in moving the world, the rest of the world, to freer trade, right? Because there's high likelihood that, the rest of the world decouples from the US in international trade. Smaller countries might not. Smaller countries have to kind of decide which way to go, China or the US. And 4 years down the road, a new administration could be pushing for freer trade and sponsors a new multilateralism, similar to the lessons, the US learned from Smoot-Hawley and the Great Depression. Those lessons have been forgotten, but they might be relearning those lessons. So prior to both those scenarios unfolding, trying to put all energy in negotiating a bilateral trade agreement with the US is likely to lead to disappointment because there is a lot of policy uncertainty. You sign a deal doesn't mean that it is a deal. Nothing prevents the US from tomorrow saying, no, we are increasing your tariffs, all right? And so that's the unreliability of the US administration. So a deal really means nothing, and India will be spending a lot of time, will be bullied into a lot of things, even if it wants to sign a bilateral trade agreement with the US, it has to simultaneously work on signing FTAs with other countries, UK, EU, Japan, South Korea. If it just negotiates with the US, that actually reduces India's negotiating power. If it has other deals alongside happening, or it's working on other deals, that actually increases India's negotiating power. So it can simultaneously work on arriving at a BTA with the US, but should not put all eggs in the US basket. And, and unilateral liberalization and working with other countries on trade deals will enhance India's negotiating power, even with respect to the US. Because the Trump administration has kept saying that they will also try to extract non-trade concessions. And what does reciprocity even mean with the formula they are using? I don't even know what it means. So how should India respond? A lot of the binding constraints are from within, not tariffs or not what tariffs other countries are imposing. There are some internal constraints. There's been a lot of tariff inversion, which means that imported inputs often have higher tariffs than the import competing output. So that needs to be reversed. And the last two budgets, there has been some progress on that. More needs to be done. With a global recession or out of a trade war, or just the trade war itself, demand for certain imported inputs might go down, might become cheaper, and role of accommodating monetary policy, for the RBI could become important to promote growth. So Amartya Lahiri made this point in a recent Indian Express piece. Without factor market reforms, as I said, the external trade environment will not be a binding constraint. There's some, there have been new reforms in terms of formulating new labor codes and making a lot of changes. But though the implementation pace has been very slow because the states are doing the implementation, I think the speed has to go up there. And that also applies to some land acquisition reforms that are needed. So also, they have to try to make it more attractive to move certain parts of supply chains to India. And some of the protectionism within India recent actually is not good for that. And of course, the labor regulations and the land reform acquisition regulations. Autonomous economic zones, might be a good idea. Arvind Panagari has talked a lot about that. In India, we have very small SEZs, the special economic zones, nothing compared to the giant SEZs in China. So autonomous economic zones could be where you have relatively relaxed regulations, you have free trade zones, you promote agglomeration through labor market pooling, and initial construction could lead to more employment there. So, there's also this other Panagaria prescription, which is that, China's share in world exports is 14%, while India's is just 2%. You can just steal a little bit of China's share. It's not going to be that difficult given rising wages in China and given the geopolitics. There is also some empirical evidence that more interregional trade and interstate trade within India actually will create much larger gains from reducing international trade barriers. So there's work by Eva van Limpoort at the Federal Reserve Board, which shows that if internal trade barriers come down to the U.S. level within India, then there could be a 13% welfare gain as opposed to a 7% welfare gain when fully eliminating international trade barriers. Investment in human capital is needed because there are lots of problems with new graduates not having the required skills. But also, I think finally, some investment in AI is needed because not to substitute labor, but to make labor more productive. China is the leader in AI, probably more advanced than the US, some say. But if labor productivity is low in India, that's going to create a lot of problems. And the one way could be to have more investment in AI that complements rather than substitutes human labor. So I'll end there.
Thank you very, very much. We'll have a very quick round of discussions among ourselves on the panel with a couple of questions from me, but then you are the main show. And while my colleagues are putting up the chairs, I'll start with my questions. Both of you discussed in different ways steps India could take itself. And I know Professor Krishna thought he may want a little bit more to discuss this issue. Please feel free to do so briefly. In doing so, also please discuss what you think is the potential for India's services sector. And also, showing my prejudice as a macroeconomist and a trade economist, do you foresee any changes in India's exchange rate policies as part of its adjustment to the new tariffs? Thank you.
Okay. Let me take the piece on services first. So as far as we understand the changes in the trade rules that have come through Liberation Day and whatever else might follow, this is primarily just for goods, right? So it does not impact services. And so maybe there isn't a first order impact on services that India should be worried about. There's a kind of a separate question that's in the background in the Indian trade policy discussions, always Indian export discussions about whether the focus on Indian export should be in manufacturing, should it be in services. So kind of a long-standing debate in the Indian context about, especially given what seems to be a kind of a lack of success with respect to Indian exports and manufacturing, whether there should be a greater focus on services and so on and so forth. So those are interesting questions. One could take the view that growth in services exports does not have to come at the expense of growth in manufacturing exports and so on and so forth. But be all of that as it may, I think it's orthogonal to this particular issue about what's going on with the Trump trade policy. So in the sense that the trade exports are not, services exports are not affected. I missed the first question. I was just sitting down as you, what was the first part of your question?
The first part was, what are the more, if you wanted to speak about more of some of the things that India needs to do, but I think you've made it very clear. But also, what role do you see for exchange rate policy as part of India's policy mix reaction to the new world?
Yeah, so just maybe a sentence or two on what India could be doing. I think Devashish made this point, and I sort of talked a bit about this as well, is that for most part, the Indian lack of success with respect to exports comes from constraints that are internal, in my view, and I think Devashish sort of articulated this as well. A variety of issues, labor markets, land markets, whatever else that's led to low Indian productivity. These are issues that were characterized the Indian economy in the past, and they continue to do so today, maybe to a slightly lesser extent. And so that's the first order question of what India might need to address, regardless of what else is going on in the international trade environment. With respect to trade policy, I would say maybe the first thing that India could think of would be how to better integrate into the regional sort of global value chains in which India has been spectacularly unsuccessful until now. We missed one opportunity with respect to the regional comprehensive economic partnership that was led by China. India had the option to join it. I think we walked out of towards the very end in 2019 for a variety of reasons, including a fear of Chinese exports, including worries on a kind of geopolitical type of concerns about China as well. I think there's at least a few Indian commentators that have some ex post regret about that step. But that sort of thing, where how do you kind of better integrate with the rest of Asia? How do you better become a factory for the world? And that, and what trade policies or other policies might support that, I think should be at the top of the Indian kind of ways of thinking about this. On exchange rate policy, for some, I'm no expert on this, and there's others here in the audience in particular who might be better able to address that question. But my general sense has been that the sense has been that the exchange rate until now has been sort of appreciated relative to where it could be, and that they could have let it go a little bit in order to maintain export competitiveness. And maybe you're seeing some of that take place sort of gradually. Maybe some of that accelerates in the context of the Trump tariffs that they're finally imposed and so on and so forth. But regardless of what happened on April 2nd and in the months leading up December, January, and so forth, some of the commentary that I followed in the Indian context sort of expressed concern about this point about the exchange rate being sort of too strong in a sense relative to where it needed to be in order to maintain competitiveness. And maybe Trump policies will just push the Indian economy in that direction anyway.
Thank you very much. Professor Mitra, you suggested that India should take a leadership role in strengthening the multilateral trade regime. What if somebody comes and says to you, WTO is dead? Multilateral trade negotiations have been dead. How would India lead in this regard?
So the first thing for India to do is unilaterally liberalize a lot of tariffs, right? India's tariffs have gone up over the last 10 to 12 years. So you cannot actually lead if you're yourself being protectionist. So that's number one, right? And then India has also been has not done really well when it comes to striking trade deals with other countries. And so basically, I know that there's this huge literature on whether bilateral or regional trade agreements lead to more multilateralism. But there could be a way where, India starts jointly negotiating with a lot of different countries, and that actually, over time, I mean, there's this huge debate on whether bilateralism leads to multilateralism or not. But there might be a way to kind of enter into deals with many countries and kind of weave them together into multilateralism. But on the other hand, the WTO is there, and other countries, it's probably time for other major countries to make the WTO stronger, and just to accept the fact that U.S. is not the country that is, it's time for the WTO to kind of, have a divorce from the U.S.
Thank you very much. We now have 10 minutes for questions from the audience. Please introduce yourselves and ask a question, a brief question. We'll start with the lady in the back I saw first. I don't know. Please.
Again, my name is Dharna, and I'm with the Tata Group here in North America. My question is to you, Professor Devashish. To your point about reducing protectionism and increasing liberalization of certain industries, which industries do you think India could focus on as part of that effort? Thinking of areas like agriculture, defense, and aerospace. If those are industries which have traditionally been protected or governed by a certain rule of law, leaving those aside, which ones do you think could be potentially the ones India could lead the way into?
So, one of the sectors that is quite protected is the automobile sector, which, there is no reason why India should not be able to compete in the world market, where there's a lot of assembly involved. There's a lot of labor-intensive activity involved. India is a labor-abundant country. What these high automobile tariffs have done to India is they made the automobile sector quite inefficient, right? The other places, when you think about artificial yarn, artificial fiber, and the tariffs are extremely high there. And that basically makes the garments that India produces using artificial yarn, fiber, is extremely expensive on the world market, that cannot compete with other countries. So those are some examples of tariff reductions that actually, because what I'm saying is that those are the inputs that are very expensive, and with those expensive inputs, the end product that goes out is very expensive. And so that basically is something that, there's scope for tariff reductions there. But there are many more, and, I can name a few more, but,
Thank you very much.
I'll take the next question.
Here, please.
I'm Ajay Kumar. I recently retired as the Defense Secretary of India. Before that, I was in the Ministry of Electronics and IT. And I was part of the decision-making process when some of the changes, which possibly have been commented upon, were taken. So I just have a very practitioner's approach to the whole thing. And I have two main questions actually to both the panelists. We start from a point where we said WTO was there, and after that there have been certain changes, largely led by US, and this are going to have neither they're going to have positive effect on US nor rest of the world. My first question is, and I was part of the system when we were discussing this, the issue was, where was WTO leading to? I mean, we were leading into a situation where there was huge domination of one country, which was creating huge geopolitical implications. So the question really is, what is the solution? I mean, maybe the solution is not good, but what is the solution to deal with a situation which is creating a huge amount of instability in multiple ways which all of us were experiencing at that point? And that's point number one. The second question which I want to say is, tariffs are bad for trade. We all broadly agree. But from the Indian, I was responsible for the start of electronics manufacturing. The lady there talked about which sectors India could open up. In 96, 97, India signed the ITA and brought zero duty on all IT items. The electronics industry, whatever small that existed in India, became zero. We started bringing some protectionism, some tariffs on electronics. Today we have a $30 billion industry in the country. We're exporting some of it. Now to a practitioner, this sounds positive results. I just want to finish by saying that to my understanding and to whatever I have read, China used to do this before they entered the WTO in 2001. Countries have used tariffs to redevelop their industry for a short time, not as a perennial measure. And once that is done, then they should, as very wisely done by China, once they had scaled up and made the industry competitive, at that point of time, they were able to remove the tariffs. So this is the interim measure which countries have. Today in electronics and certain items, especially mobile phones, India has created scale, and we are okay with competing. Although we're still not there to compete with China, but we are pretty competitive with the rest of the world. So once we have reached scale, having introduced protectionism as an interim measure, then it helps you to then reopen, and as a strategic measure, you could do this. Thank you very much.
Please note we have about 3 minutes of a hard deadline.
Okay. So very quickly, the same logic was used after independence, that, let's have protectionism for a brief period of time, and then, that would basically, we are now infants, the infant industry protection argument was used. And once, we become more advanced in these industries, we'll be able to compete with the rest of the world. Many of the countries are adults in those industries. What happened was that protectionism got captured, where, manufacturers actually invested more in preserving that protectionism rather than actually, improving their efficiency and competing with the rest of the world. So that, that there is no guarantee which way protectionism will go. And we saw that over over about half a century, slightly less than half a century, India suffered because of that. So, this is a very, using protectionism for growth or, making our industries more efficient is a very risky strategy. It has worked sometimes, but, most of the times it has failed, like in India, in Latin America, and so on. So, more than that, I don't really have an answer to your question.
Let me quickly take the point about the WTO. This was a bit to the question that you raised as well, Adnan, about what India could do. So it is true that the WTO had dominant powers, the US being one of them, but the dominance of the US in the WTO did not prevent China from doing as well as it did in the context of the WTO. So if you look at what happened between 2000 to 2025, China has done tremendously well. The same set of trade rules that we face, and we haven't, right? So US dominance is what it is, but China's done very well, and we haven't in the same context, with the same fears of a dominant partner and so on. So I think we should reflect on where we fell short on that. That's point number one. Point number two is that the most recent round of trade negotiations, which was the Doha Development Round, we had every opportunity in that situation to evolve a discussion about liberalization in ways that might have suited India's interests. And you probably are well aware of the ways in which that did not take place. It was in the hands of the developing countries, and divisions within the developing countries of who's a food exporter and who's not, and who's got various other concerns, has essentially led to that discussion being frozen altogether. But with that, let me stop here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
You can do it. I just wanted to say, even if India was to become a China and dominate, that doesn't reflect well on the WTO order. I mean, we are not trying to create monopoly countries, really. We want to create countries which have equal opportunity for growth and development for the world. Any system which is forcing one nation, and that's a point, but that's the way, but I don't think we can take it offline also, but that's the point which I wanted to make.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Professors Mitra and Krishna. And I'm sure those of you who are interested can harass them in the break. Thank you.